Our show is now on Stitcher. Listen to us on your iPhone, Android phone, Kindle Fire, and other devices with Stitcher. Stitcher is smart radio for your phone. Find it in your App Store or on Stitcher.com. Stitcher Smart Radio, the smarter way to listen to radio.
Pray with me if you will. Come, Holy Spirit, come. Come with the fire and burn. Come with the rain and cleanse. Come with the wind and breathe. Come with the light and reveal. Convict us, convert us, consecrate us. Claim and call us with your care and concern, O God, until we do something. Amen. Amen. Scholars tell us that the so-called synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, each have a version of this great commandment. Through research, they are also able to determine that it comes to us from Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, and is the basis of the totality of the commandment. Virtually everything read in the first verse of Mark 28 is contained in Deuteronomy 6. This in the Gospels, it becomes two commandments. In Deuteronomy, it's a single commandment. Furthermore, while we all know a commandment is either an immediate or implied demand, quite different from a suggestion, which would be more of a question or a concern. However, both a commandment and a suggestion begin with a thought. So on All Saints' Day, let's pause in thought about those who have shaped us and the society we live in, and how they continue to imprint upon our lives, to have imprint upon our lives. Of course, I've talked about my parents a lot over time and space. Probably talked more about my mom because, as I've said from time to time, I was more of a mama's boy. My pop, though, had a favorite saying, and if he was talking to me, he'd say, "Joey, if you keep your mouth shut long enough and your ears open long enough, you will find that you are bound to learn something each day." When I have practiced this, I've found it to be quite true. I'd like to say I've practiced it every single day I've drawn breath, but that would not be true. But it's still that kind of practical wisdom that still has import and imprint upon me. I've talked about Garden Grove United Methodist Church in Orange County. That was the church of my upbringing. From time to time, I've named several different people, but I just want to talk about 4 families. These are those people that Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation, just simply because of the way they lived. So I mentioned the Nelson family, the Davis family, the Hayes family, and the Sothan families. Each gave tangible gifts of spiritual support, living in a way that befits the gospel. In addition, on behalf of the entire congregation, when I was ordained in 1981, they gave me a cross made of antique spoons, which I still wear on occasion. I have it on now. I don't wear it as often as I used to because it used to interfere quite heavily with my mic. You'll tell me later if it still is. Still thinking about those who imprint us. Not all of them come from church. Some come from schools, some come from other places. They could be coaches or teachers. C.J. Skirvin Jr. is one of those. Though he was a person of faith, he was the scoutmaster when I was in Scouts from about, I think it was age 10. Somehow they bent the rules that allowed myself and a boyhood friend to join a little bit early. So from about 11 to 17, he was my scoutmaster. And then from 17 to 24, when he died suddenly from a heart ailment, he was a good friend, imparting wisdom that I still find useful today. Back to church. The church I served in 29 Palms, just before I went there, Reverend Lloyd Sation, late of this annual conference, gave me a wonderful bit of advice that I took him up on. He said, Leverett Broski retired to 29 Palms to become their postmaster. He said, look him up. When I was the pastor at Palm Springs, he was just a wonderful lifesaver, he and his wife, Barbara. And I did, and they were glorious and helpful and wonderful beyond measure. Ren Tisdale was a member at 29 Palms, and he had been a butcher at one of the local markets before the big chains moved in. And he spoke of James Cagney, the actor who had not a retirement home, more of a retreat out in the desert, would come in and talk to him, and he spoke glowingly about how kind this man was to him. Well, Ren was dying of lung cancer at the same time my dad was, but he still came to church until he became too weak. And I don't know who suggested it, because I don't think I knew it intentionally. Probably somebody who loved Ren and loved me enough to help me said, why don't you take Ren communion? And I did. And Ren looked at me and he said, I've been a Methodist my whole life. And then he started to cry a little bit, and he said, I've never had a pastor bring me communion. And he thanked me, but what he gave me was much more than what I gave him. Just was, in a profound moment, was able to remember what it means to be part of community together. Just a thought. I served Rubidoux United Methodist Church before I came here, and had a wonderful time. Yeah, there are people that I annoyed and who annoyed me, but wonderful, wonderful time. Rubidoux was founded, chartered, that means, in 1963, and about 40 years later, from charter to closure, was a faithful servant of the community. I cried when they closed the church, and just wondered what more I might have done to have helped it. Two names come to mind, though there are many. Gladys Lamb, who in my first year made the transition from living on her own and great independence to transitional care, to what they now mostly call assisted living. She just could not do all of it to run a house anymore. And I remember one of the times I was visiting, she gave me a lesson in elder care, and it's much more clear now than it was then. She said about getting older, she said, just because we are old does not mean we can't taste. She was talking about the food that was prepared and how they could have made it taste better. She was a marvelous cook, so she was probably right. Winifred Knudsen moved from Nebraska with her husband, and he had died a couple years before I was assigned to Rubidoux. She made an appointment, came in to see me, and she said, Pastor, I have something pretty serious to ask of you. And I said, okay. And she said, the church that I went to, the Methodist church in Nebraska, the pastor always called me by name when serving communion. Do you suppose you could call me by name? Friends, I try to remember and call you by name. But I'm getting old and I have senior moments. So if I forget, please have pity on me. It was a tremendous, life-changing gift that Winifred gave me. Back to Garden Grove United Methodist for just a second. As a student minister on staff, I was also the sexton, which means I opened and closed. And in my scurrying about, I noticed something during the coffee hour. Mr. Brown, an elderly man, then well into his 80s, maybe even 90s, and Mrs. East, a middle-aged woman, were exchanging tins, fairly large tins. And I knew Mrs. East better, so I asked, what's with the tin exchange? Cookies. He liked cookies, and she liked baking, and she baked him cookies every week. She received from him an empty tin, and she gave him a tin full of cookies. Saints are all around us. Some seem so obvious, and some not so, until we encounter. Some of you know that I live here in North Hollywood. In the flyer for the home Sue and I were privileged to buy, along with the help of this congregation, the flyer had a phrase, "Close walk to temples," to which I thought, well, I wouldn't be doing a lot of witnessing in my neighborhood, which for the most part has been true. On the other hand, I have been witnessed to some wonderful experiences. My neighbors who are Jewish have been polite, devout, and family-centered. Good people. On a Saturday recently, I was walking past a temple, and when doing so, I try to be polite, not speaking, and try to be certain not to encroach upon the people as they're gathering or coming or going. But as I approached the temple, I saw an older man, by which I mean a guy probably my age, maybe even a little bit younger. And he was talking to a younger man, probably somebody in his 30s. They were both well-dressed, the older man in formal worship attire, which means that shawl, and he had the black felt hat and the tefillin, the religious attire under the shawl. The younger man in a suit wearing a yarmulke. The older man was leading the conversation. I moved a bit further away on the sidewalk out of respect. I thought they were talking about some fine point of Judaic law or theology. As I passed, I expected to hear them conversing in Hebrew. They were talking loud enough for me to hear, even with my diminished hearers. As I passed, I expected to hear them conversing in Hebrew. However, to my surprise, the older man said in plain English, "You've got to be kidding." And then he named a popular NFL quarterback and said he could not throw a straight pass if his life depended on it. My assumptions were obviously blown apart, but what a sweet and saintly experience. They were engaging on a variety of levels, and if that's not spiritual, I don't know what is. In a column this past Friday in the Daily News, Dennis McCarthy, who's a respected and featured columnist, reflected on the 100th birthday of Frank Sinatra, which, had he lived, would have happened next month. It seems it will still happen because his son, Frank Sinatra Jr., is mounting a celebration at the Sabin Theater here in Los Angeles. And he seeks to speak of the truth of his father's legend. And we all have opinions about celebrities. Whether Mr. Sinatra was a saint or a sinner or a solid mixture of both, 17 years after exiting the stage, literally and figuratively, Frank Sinatra still sells records and generates a buzz, which is to say culture creates its own saints, now doesn't it? Just as an aside, my dad liked Frank Sinatra's singing, and so I had this um, I, give me a second, I'm having a senior moment. My dad loved to listen to Chuck Cecil on KFI, which had an oldies question. Somebody told me that Chuck Cecil, now into his 90s, is still very much alive, but does not do radio anymore. I think he has some kind of a podcast. Anyways, my father's two favorite singers were Perry Como and Bing Crosby. And I never asked him why, I just think he liked the way they sang. Just another thought with regard to culture. On NPR a few days ago with Larry Mantle out of KPCC in Pasadena, Larry was interviewing Elena Douglas, an actor, writer, director, producer, and the granddaughter of the iconic actor Melvyn Douglas. The book she has written is about blaming Dennis Hopper for ruining her life. Those of you who don't know, the late actor Dennis Hopper was the writer, director, actor in Easy Rider, along with Peter Fonda, and there were others, but they basically funded this and made it happen. And the reason she says Dennis Hopper ruined her life is because this movie, Easy Rider, caused her parents to found a hippie commune in suburban Connecticut. That's a little hard to get your head around because suburbia is not someplace you think about founding a commune, but that's what happened. And she wove in this conversation, in this interview, stories of her grandfather, who she said when she visited either in Los Angeles or New York, she said it was amazing to her that just Melvyn Douglas's signature on a plain piece of paper could get her into the finest restaurants and allow her to purchase whatever she wanted at any business. She goes on to say that she became friends with Dennis Hopper and acted with him in a couple of films, and she goes on to say that she really didn't have a sense of who her grandfather was other than an important person until she did a film with him later in life. For her, this saintly experience was, if not a daily experience, a regular experience which revealed itself over time and space. Now, I don't expect all of you to know who the Rolling Stones are, but most of you should because they're popular, even in their 70s. A number of years ago, they had a song which was titled, "You'll Never Make a Saint of Me." And it begins with, St. Paul the persecutor was a cruel and sinful man. Jesus hit him with a blinding light. And then his life began. Now, had I known what was going to precede me, I would have had my guitar and we would have sung this together. But we don't have time for that. So the second line references St. Thomas Aquinas. And the refrain is, "You'll never make a saint of me." Well, in time and space, for whatever reason, Mick Jagger, who penned and sang that, moves closer to sainthood. Oh, he continues to be the bad boy of rock and roll, so to speak. He continues to use his energy and effort to do good, and that blesses him and others. I don't know how many of you get Bishop Carcaño's. Bishop Carcaño is our bishop for this regional area. She does regular newsletter things, and it's at calpac.org if you're interested. And I encourage you to look at the website because it gives a lot of information about what we're about as a national and international church. Well, yesterday in Bishop's All Saints' Eve message, she wrote extensively about her mom, Rebecca, and she first spoke of her mom out at Indian Wells for the clergy convocation on ministry in September. She talked about her mother's 20-year struggle with Alzheimer's. And she talked about that, juxtaposing it against the right to die with dignity, of which Jerry Brown has just signed, our governor has just signed this bill. And she expressed her own views, saying, I never had the conversation with my mom, so I don't know what her wishes would have been. She, Bishop Carcano, and her siblings just continue to love and care for her mom as life moves on. She goes on to say candidly that the Book of Discipline, or the social principles of the United Methodist Church, speak strongly against euthanasia or the right to die. But she talks about the fact that we're human and we come to these issues with our own skin on us and our own views and our own nervousness, if you will. She closed the article, or very near the close. She has a statement about her mom has had several brushes with death and has pulled through. And she said after one of them, her mom woke up and looked at her children and said, I don't know, I thought I could get through this. I don't know your names, but I know you are mine. We are so terribly human, so are the saints named here. So are the saints there and in the balcony and here, and those we drag around in our hearts. So I have just a thought for you. I want you to go home and look in the mirror. And if you're honest, you'll be like Henry Ward Beecher, the 19th century preacher, who said when he looked in the mirror, he saw something like 2 parts chicken and 3 parts fool. Yeah. But look past and see the saints you are, the saints you're becoming, the saints you are to people who don't speak it, the saints you will be eternally. May it ever be so. Amen.
Thank you for listening to the First United Methodist Church podcast, which is recorded live every week at 4832 Tahunga Avenue in North Hollywood, California, and delivered by Dr. Joey McDonald. For more info on us, please check out nohofumc.com or find us on Facebook and Twitter under NoHoFUMC.